Okay, good morning. Welcome to the Special Committee on Housing. It's 10 o'clock. We're going to get started. We have a couple public hearings today, and exec session, but the first thing we're going to do is the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, so starting with the first public hearing, we have SB 408. I'm going to call on Grant Bossy, representing Senator Ricciardi. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Chairman Alexander, members of the Housing Committee. I am Grant Bossy from the New Hampshire Senate, introducing SB 408 on behalf of Senator Denise Ricciardi, the bill's prime sponsor. This bill should look very familiar to you, as it is very similar to HB 1168, creating a committee to study the effects of the housing crisis on the disability community and hopefully recommending policy solutions that can strengthen opportunities for independence. The Senate is scheduled to approve HB 1168 next week, but with an amendment. I would like you to note the Senate HHS Committee extended the final reporting date to November 1st, 2025, and added an interim report for November 1st, 2024. I would suggest you coordinate with Senator Birdsall rather than pass two overlapping but slightly different studies into law. If you have any questions, I can get them to Senator Ricciardi and make sure to get you an answer. Senator Ricciardi thanks you for your consideration and support for Senate Bill 408. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there questions for Mr. Bossy? My only question is, does Senator Ricciardi support the bill as amended in the Senate?
Yes, it went through with unanimous support. It's on the consent calendar. Everybody agrees, giving the committee an extra year. We're a lot closer to November 1st than when we first heard the bill.
And that was one of the concerns as well.
And the concerns was giving them enough time, but still getting some information out by November 1st, and then giving them until 2025 to get a final report in.
So my only question would be, legislators that are appointed to that committee that decide not to run for re-election or are re-elected, are they still serving on that committee?
They would be reappointed. You would fill any vacancy possibly
fill a
with a new
vacancy.
member if those
Okay.
if those members weren't reelected or didn't choose to run.
Thank you. Other questions? Seeing none?
I think that makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Mr. Chair.
Oh, Representative Damon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. Thank you. So I just have a question in comparing the Senate bill that you've just introduced with House Bill 1168, which, as you note, is remarkably similar. The Senate bill specifies studying the effects of the 2008 housing crisis, which seems to be a narrower scope than 1168, which doesn't specify a specific year date housing crisis. And the House version speaks to the committee evaluating potential remedies for increasing the supply of housing. That language is not in the Senate bill. So if you have any information on those differences, or if the senator could get back to us about that, I think, frankly, I prefer the language of the House bill.
Okay, I think they were just differences in drafting as the different sponsors put the bill together. They made slightly different choices in how it was worded. I know the suggestion for the bill came from some of the same stakeholders, and then they just introduced it in the House and the Senate. They went through the process and came out slightly different ways. Which way is preferable? That's a policy decision, and I don't get a vote.
Thank you.
All right. Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
The only other speaker I have on this bill is Representative Kathy Staub.
Good morning. Thank you for hearing my testimony. I will be extremely brief because you've heard me before. And I just wanted to let you know that I support the changes that were made to my bill in the Senate. And I think having an extended time period, having an interim report for low hanging fruit, and then a longer study to determine some other ways that we might increase the supply of affordable housing for people with disabilities. I also just wanted to share with you the GAP report from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. It outlines what the problem is. For every 100 people that make 100% of median income and need an apartment, there are 103 units. When you get down to 30% of median income, which are people that are on disability or Social Security, there are only 38 affordable units, which means that they would only have to pay 30% of their income for their housing. There are only 38 units for every 100 people that need them, or 100 households that need them. So I just copied that off for you, and I'm going to hand it out. And does anyone have any questions for me?
Thank you. Are there questions for Representative? Seeing
Okay.
none, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else wishing to testify on SB 408? All right, seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing, and I guess we have 8 minutes, so we'll be in recess for 8 minutes. started. So I'm going to open up the public hearing on SB 527. Call on Jenny Horgan, who's speaking on behalf of Senator Prentice. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Jenny Horgan. I am the Policy Director for the Senate Democratic Caucus. I am introducing Senate Bill 527 on behalf of Senator Sue Prentice. Senate Bill 527 is relative to student housing. It includes a student housing municipal, a study committee, as well as a policy statement as out of the Senate. Senator Prentice is very regretful that she wasn't able to be here today. Basically, overarching concept on this bill and the reason she brought it forward was because of the great need that our communities have to find affordable housing for students, for workforce. The bill as it stands has a policy statement that makes clear, the intent of a collaborative nature between universities and municipalities in terms of building a housing stock that is diverse and works for everyone involved. There's also a study committee that has duties to look at housing options for students in those communities as well. I know that there is a non-germane hearing after this amendment. Senator Prentice, certainly supports the Senate position of the bill. She has some concerns about the non-germane amendment. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have about the underlying bill or the non-germane amendment. I'd be happy to take those back to her.
Any questions for Jenny Horgan? Representative Walsh.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you know why, I'm looking at the original 527, do you know why section Roman 6 was taken out and actually turned into the study committee instead? Because actually, I like the look of section 6 in the original bill better than I like the non-germane amendment.
So I know that in the Senate hearing, the senator spoke to that idea. She did bring forward the amendment that was a replace all, just including that original policy statement and a study committee. She heard a lot of feedback and concerns about that enforcement language and decided to move forward with the bill as it currently stands.
Thank you.
Other questions? Representative Reed.
Thank you, and thank you for taking my question. Has the senator given information about where she would stand on if the non-germane amendment was in addition to a study committee instead of replacing it?
I can certainly take that back to her and have her get back to the committee.
I just have a brief question. This is creating another study committee to study like a solution to the student housing problem in the state. But then the non-germane amendment is a policy solution to deal with the student housing problem in the state. I guess I'm wondering if the senator, do we just want to study it, or is the senator in favor of like making movements to actually solve the problem?
I think the senator,
Please
as
send
well
that
as
to
the
her.
entire Senate, is very invested in finding actual solutions to
Okay.
problem. But as currently stands, the study committee is the Senate position on the bill. So I can certainly take that back to her, but I would say that she supports the bill as it currently stands.
Okay. I have seen a lot of study committees come from the Senate this year. That's why I ask.
Sure, of
Thank you.
course.
All right. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else here to testify on SB 527, not the non-germane amendment? Just the underlying bill. Okay. So seeing none, we are in recess till 10:30. Just waiting for my Democratic colleagues to come back in the room, and then we'll get started. Welcome back, Special Committee on Housing. I'm going to open up the, actually, I'm going to let Representative Rudy run this public hearing because I am on the amendment, non-germane amendment. So Chairman Rudy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You want to read into the minutes the amendment or introduce it?
It's you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. You want to sit here or out there?
Oh, Representative Powers.
Oh, there's a whole bunch of people. So you want to introduce it from out there and then we'll,
No, I'm just going to ask questions.
oh, you're going to ask questions. Oh, okay. Okay. Where are we? Introducing Diane Power.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and honorable committee members. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce to you today Amendment 1482 to Senate Bill 527. For the record, I am Representative Diane Power. I represent the towns of Brookline, Mason, and Greenville in Hillsborough County, District 36. To begin, this amendment is largely based upon House Bill 1281, relative to zoning restrictions on residential rental property, which has a strong bipartisan support in the House and the Senate. And it was filed upon the request of a large group of concerned citizens. Notably, House Bill 1281 was originally referred to this committee, but was vacated and assigned to municipal and county government at the behest of the chair of that committee. The bill then was strategically allowed to be tabled in the House. Now, this amendment is straightforward, common sense legislation, which simply prohibits municipalities from enacting and enforcing zoning ordinances related to the occupancy of any single-family, duplex, or multifamily dwelling based on familial or non-familial relationships or marital status among the occupants, or restricts the number of occupants to less than 2 per bedroom. Additionally, this amendment is the product of months of collaboration with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, municipal attorneys from across the country, housing advocates, and a number of citizen groups here in the state. The New Hampshire Youth Movement, as well as the New Hampshire University of New Hampshire Senate, to name a few. This legislation is needed in our state because I have found that there are at least 8 municipalities with zoning ordinances that unreasonably limit the number of unrelated people allowed to rent and occupy a residential dwelling unit. In fact, some municipalities arbitrarily restrict this number to no more than 3 unrelated people, regardless of the size and number of bedrooms in the housing unit. This is commonly referred to as the 3 unrelated rule. Under this particular type of ordinance, it would be illegal for 4 unrelated young professionals, students, or even senior citizens to live together in, for example, a 4-bedroom rental unit. Whereas, at the same time, a family of 8 with 2 married adults and 6 children would legally be permitted to live in the same 4-bedroom unit. Thus, in this example, 1 to 5 housing opportunities are eliminated by such unreasonable zoning ordinances as we see in the 3 unrelated rule. In the midst of a housing crisis, zoning ordinances like this are highly problematic for a number of reasons. First and foremost, overly restrictive zoning ordinances are a clear infringement by the government on property rights of individuals to freely utilize their private property in a reasonable and responsible manner that does not pose any genuine health and safety concerns. Furthermore, I contend that if the basis for such ordinances are truly related to health and safety, then it would logically follow that any occupancy restrictions on residential housing should be equally applied to all residential property within the town. Significantly, these overly restrictive zoning ordinances apply only to unrelated rental households and not to related households. Even more problematic, I found that, for example, in the town of Durham, in which zoning ordinances restrict unrelated households to no more than 3 unrelated occupants, this does not equally apply to all residential rental properties in the town, as some properties are grandfathered from this 3 unrelated rule. Second, overreaching zoning ordinances that go beyond health and safety negatively impact the affordability and the supply of housing in the Granite State by arbitrarily restricting the use of available housing. It is an indisputable fact that New Hampshire currently has an inadequate supply of affordable housing and a severe shortage of rental housing in general. Make no mistake, restrictive zoning ordinances drive up rental costs, and it reduces the number of available housing units, which further compounds our housing crisis. Third, restrictive zoning ordinances are unfair, to say the very least. As a result of the 3 unrelated rule, I was told by a property owner that he had been accused of racism and discrimination towards 4 unrelated black men who wanted to rent one of his properties. To be clear, the property in question could have easily accommodated these 4 men. The men understandably became very upset when the property owner explained to them that he would be unable to rent his property to these 4 men due to a local zoning ordinance that restricted the rental occupancy to no more than 3 unrelated people. Because the men became upset because they knew of a house in the very same town that was being rented to 8 unrelated Chinese restaurant workers. And fourth, restrictive zoning ordinances artificially limit housing opportunities for people seeking housing. Understand there are many reasons for which unrelated individuals might seek to share housing. For example, college students might want to share housing to be able to afford the cost of room and board and tuition. Working professionals of all ages might seek to share housing in order to reduce expenses and to be able to pay off their college loans. Others find themselves in difficult circumstances, such as persons widowed, divorced, or retired, people living on fixed or low incomes, people who have downsized or who are experiencing loss of employment, and the elderly and the disabled are but a few examples that come to mind. These groups of people may choose or even need to share housing costs and expenses in order to avoid homelessness. Finally, I will make one last important point. New Hampshire is not a home rule state. It is a Dillon's rule state. Therefore, in New Hampshire, a local government's authority is derived only from the power granted to it by the state legislature. And importantly, the power to amend such local authority is in fact reserved and fully retained by the state legislature. As such, under RSA 674:16, municipalities have been granted the power by the legislature to both adopt and amend zoning ordinances for the purpose of promoting health, safety, or the general welfare of the community. It is clear that the power to adopt zoning ordinances is being unreasonably used by some municipalities in a manner that blatantly is overreaching and extends well beyond the express objectives set forth in statute, as is evidenced by such zoning ordinances as the 3 unrelated rule. Therefore, it is incumbent upon our state legislature to intervene on the behalf of its citizens and to amend the powers it has granted to these municipalities. Fittingly, this amendment revises RSA 674:16, grant of power relative to zoning, in order to provide the appropriate guardrails to local zoning powers granted by the state legislature to municipalities. In sum, this amendment upholds the inherent rights of property owners, guards against unfair practices and unwarranted discrimination towards unrelated people seeking housing, and helps to lower rental costs for Granite Staters by immediately increasing the housing supply when currently unused housing is placed back onto the free market. Therefore, I urge this committee to adopt this amendment and to subsequently recommend Senate Bill 527 ought to pass as amended. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my bill introduction. I'm happy to answer any questions. However, in the interest of time, I see there are a number of people behind me. So perhaps questions could be tailored to the people behind me. And I'd like to thank you for your time and your consideration.
Well, thank you. But does anyone have a question directly? No? Okay. Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. and Thank you for taking my question. I mean, it's clear what some of these ordinances are doing, trying to prevent frat houses in the middle of their neighborhoods. Perhaps in your examples, some of them may have gone too far or may sound kind of unreasonable. So if we adopt this amendment, I don't see any guardrails in it to prevent 24 people from living in a 3-bedroom, 26 by 40 ranch. What do you think is reasonable for the amount of people living in a 2640 ranch with 3 bedrooms?
So, as is stated in the amendment, I have specified that there's no local zoning ordinance shall restrict the number of occupants to less than 2 per bedroom. Depending upon the size of the bedroom in question, it is reasonable to be able to house 2 people per bedroom. Now, that being said, that would be, up to the landlord and the people renting. That both those groups, those parties may not be interested in having 2 people per bedroom. But we want to be able to have the flexibility. And to be clear, I'm not interested in animal houses. That's not what this amendment is about. And there are other, when you get to more, with regards to boarding houses, I honestly don't recall if that threshold is 4 or 5. But at that point, then there are codes, building codes and fire codes that would apply. And so I would contend that those are guardrails to your concerns.
Okay. Follow up.
Yes, follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, the animal house, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually what the ordinances are trying to prohibit. So let me ask you a question, though, because I don't see a definition of bedroom either. So say you have a 26 by 40 ranch with 3 bedrooms. Is there anything to prevent turning the dining room into another bedroom and turning the den into another bedroom? In other words, when does this stop? When there's 16 people living in a house? What could possibly go wrong?
Thank you, Representative. I appreciate that question. So we know, based on the assessment cards for a particular property, we can pull the assessment card and we can see, the number of bedrooms. So that, to me, that would be a guide as to how many bedrooms are in a property.
I'm not going to believe it. You can change anything you want on the card.
Okay. Anyone else? Representative Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative, for your testimony. I find it to be very compelling. In addition to the points that you have very clearly spelled out, do you think that if, in fact, these local ordinances are meant to address unsavory behavior in a community, for example, that it makes more sense to perhaps have ordinances to address the actual behaviors, for example, a noise ordinance, and enforce those ordinances rather than kind of arbitrarily limiting occupancy for one type of housing? And I think maybe we could get to the same place if we simply said a municipality may not have an ordinance that limits occupancy on the basis of whether a property is rental or owned, because if you're going to have an occupancy ordinance, it should be across the board. But do you think that it makes more sense to control the behaviors that are unsavory rather than arbitrarily controlling occupancy?
Thank you for the question, Representative. That's an excellent point, and I agree with your assertions. Clearly, there are ordinances on the books in municipalities which deal with those types of concerns, with noise, with parking, with trash, etc. What has come to my attention that restricting the number of occupants to 3, that this 3 unrelated rule is another attempt to control those types of concerns, which to me is highly inappropriate, and it doesn't make any sense because it's infringing upon property rights of individuals. A municipality doesn't have the right to do that. The Constitution provides for property owners to be able to utilize and enjoy their property in a manner that's reasonable. And municipalities that have adopted such ordinances those ordinances are overreaching, and they infringe upon those rights. And it's inappropriate. And like I've stated, that when we see this happening, it's incumbent upon the New Hampshire General Court to step in and to rectify the situation.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again. In addition, do you think that it's possible to interpret some of these ordinances that restrict on the basis of related status, in addition to all of the discrimination you've already kind of put out, that it could be a kind of like moral legislating on the part of the town? For example, it's fine for you to live in the same bedroom if you are married, but if you are simply dating, we don't want you in the same bedroom.
Thank you for the question, Representative. Yes, that could be the case in some instances for these types of ordinances. And in fact, in my work on this bill, I have in fact learned of a situation where 2 unmarried individuals who were in a relationship were denied the opportunity to rent housing for the very fact that they were unmarried.
Okay. Anyone else?
Mr. Chair?
Rep-
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. You mentioned boarding houses, and were you referring to rooming houses?
Thank you for the question. Yes. Yeah.
Because rooming houses, the single room that the person lives in that's their domicile, and they have a lock and key. So it isn't like because there are 10 rooms, rented in a rooming house that's overly occupied. So it's 1 person per unit or 2 people per unit, whatever.
This would not apply to that, to those types of residences.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Is that it? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Al Holland, representing himself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, for taking my testimony. I'm Al Holland. I represent Stratford 20, which is Durham, Lee, Madbury, and a sliver of Dover. I've spent from 2016 to 22 on the Durham Town Council, and I'm currently on the Durham Advisory Housing Task Force, where we used Invest New Hampshire money to do a housing needs assessment of our community. So as this similar amendment came through the municipal county committee, there was one community that was really talked about almost exclusively, and that was Durham. And Durham is unusual in the fact that I did demographically in the state, 18 to 24-year-olds make up about 9.1% of the population. In Durham, it's about 66%, which really speaks to what we are, which is a college community. And it's, let me just say, even despite what the testimony was in municipal county, it's a great place to live. Our issue really has been that UNH does not provide enough housing for their students. And we currently house about 4,054 students in off-campus complexes. And the difficulty that we really had came about from non-owner occupied single family units that had been bought by investors and used as student housing. And we had real difficulties as investors came in and these became nuisance houses. I think it was referred to, why don't we address what we do? Of course, we have noise ordinances, we have trash ordinances, we have a community policing officer that came in. But it takes an extraordinary long time as you work through the fine system and finally the court system to deal with it, and the neighbors suffer. And so what Durham did is we in fact changed our zoning, and it was actually more liberal than the amendment asks for. And I think the question was raised, what is reasonable? In state fire code, it's 200 square foot per occupant. You don't use bedroom because, as was mentioned, you can get pretty creative when you try to think about what a bedroom is. And so what we did is we picked a zone that was the best suited for student housing right around the campus, and we gave great density bonus, which was 300 square foot per occupant, no related, unrelated involved, just per occupant. And we built 2,000 units of student housing. And it's worked really, really well. It's close to campus, they're well managed, and we've had very little problems with it. Additionally, in the collar zones around it, which was single family housing, we loosened the requirements for ADUs and really made it enticing for homeowners to build ADUs. And we have 250 ADUs were built, and we've had absolutely no problems with those. The problems really have resided still in those single family houses. And so let me clarify, student housing differs from regular rental housing by the lease. In the lease of a student house, it's less than a year, which kind of follows the academic calendar, which is what you see in dorms. The second thing is it's priced per occupant. So the idea that you would take a one bedroom and share it, that doesn't happen. In any occupant has a separate lease and they're paying to the landlord. So if you have a house and you put 8 people in it, all 8 people are paying to the landlord on a separate lease. And what we found in our housing needs assessment is that actually drives up the overall cost of the apartment. And that's boxing out both graduate students who cannot afford the cost that undergraduates can, and our workforce. So in terms of the 3 unrelated, which we did put in single family homes that border that area, it was not arbitrary. In fact, that's based on fire code. And so when you look in the definition of fire code, when you move from 3 to 4 unrelated, and that's 4 to up to 16, and they share a kitchen, it is no longer classified as a single family home. It is classified as a lodging house. And that changes the fire code requirement of it. And there, by the way, in fire code, the unrelated and related is embedded in our fire code. What the fire code says is that related people, believe it or not, are more likely to care for each other, and so it lowers the overall fire risk. Unrelated don't. And so therefore, there's a higher requirement that's built into fire code to address that. You guys changed the legislation so that addressed the sprinkler. But in the chapter 26 of the fire code, there's a greater requirement for egress in that 4 to 16 lodging house. And so as a community, in essence, what we said, the 3 unrelated is saying, we as a community do not want lodging houses to reside in our single family or our residential zones. And so that's the logic before it. And it seems to have worked really, really well. I would also point out, though, we're not the only college town in New Hampshire. Hanover has also addressed this similar issue, particularly with student leases. And so what they did is, instead of doing the 3 unrelated, they broadened the definition of unrelated, which I have recommended, by the way, to Durham. By broadening the definition of unrelated, what they were really trying to do is to strip off students, and particularly that student leasing structure that really boxes out the identified groups that we really wanted, and not allowing that in certain areas. So we're zoning to put students in, and again, we've put over 2,000 units in, and having areas that really aren't the prime area for students, for residents and workforce outside of that. Additionally, what we've been working on with new zoning is to try to do workforce overlay districts. The workforce overlay districts, what we'll do is we'll give density bonuses to do workforce housing in perpetuity. Our housing assessment need identified zones that are on water and sewer, public water and sewer, and those are rife to build more apartments. The apartments that really are better designed to deal with both graduate students and our workforce. And I think that was a lot of information to throw pretty quick, and I hope I didn't take too much time, and I'm open to any questions.
Okay, any questions? Representative Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question. I appreciate that you said that you are representing yourself and obviously your district and not necessarily the town council, but I have a question that I'm hoping you'll be able to answer as your experience on the town council. From what I'm reading, and perhaps this is something that's already been changed, and I'm reading something old, but in your ordinance, you have under number 4 for accessory apartments, an ordinance that says, in zoning districts where no more than 3 unrelated persons may occupy a dwelling unit, there shall be no more than 3 unrelated occupants in total for the single-family dwelling unit and an accessory dwelling unit combined, or for the single-family dwelling and the accessory apartment combined. And my question is, don't you feel that that conflicts directly? I don't know if the town's actually enforced that in terms of 3 unrelated for an entire property, including the ADU. And as you know, I'm very fond of ADUs, and I actually worked with your town planner on the ADU bill. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate y'all's work in the town on that. But in existing law, and not my bill, it actually says that the municipality may not require a familial relationship between the occupants of an accessory dwelling unit and the occupancy of the principal dwelling unit, which, as my understanding of interpreting the existing law as I just read it and your ordinance, would mean that if you would enforce that ordinance, that would have been an illegal enforcement of that ordinance, because the state does not allow a town to require an occupancy, a relationship between the occupancy between the primary unit and the accessory dwelling unit. So are you familiar with this conflict, or has it been enforced, or is this changed already?
So that's a good question. Thank you for asking it. So to start off with, all the ADUs that we've had currently are relatively small. So putting 3 occupants in would be a challenge. This question was asked of me, though. If this goes through, first of all, the ADU has not been signed by the governor yet, but if it did go through, my reading of it would be that the state would take precedence. And so the 3 unrelated would only relate to each individual unit. So the ADU would have 3 unrelated. The primary residence theoretically could have only 3 unrelated. And again, that would only relate to single-family homes.
Follow
Follow up. So I don't know if I miscommunicated. The section of law I read is not the bill. This is existing statute. Existing statute prohibits a town from requiring a familial relationship between the owners, the occupiers of the primary and the ADU. Your ordinance, as I currently read it, unless it's been changed and I am not aware, says that you can require, in essence, through your 3 unrelated occupancy rule, you can require a familial relationship, essentially. And so so just to be clear, it's not a matter of the ADU is going to be signed or not by the governor. It is a matter of current existing law, and has Durham broken the law by enforcing this particular ordinance?
I'll give you a simple answer. No, we have not. It has never been enforced.
Okay. Representative Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. With your permission, Mr. Chair, I have 3 questions, and I'll ask them one at a time.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. My questions have to do with your testimony and are also based on personal experience from having lived for 5 years in a neighborhood of Brookline, Massachusetts, that was about half students and half families. And you mentioned that UNH doesn't provide enough housing for its students, which I'm sure is perfectly possible. But even if UNH provided all the housing that could reasonably be expected, wouldn't there still be some students who prefer to live in rental apartments? So wouldn't that issue still come up?
So that's a good question. Actually, the group that really wanted to live off campus is graduate students, because the problem that the university has is that Oyster River is a cooperative district. And so if a family of graduate students lives on campus, they have to pay tuition to go into Oyster River School District. And so the university really, believe me, it really was. And so that it was really, there was pressure on the university because at one point they were paying like $80,000 a year to the school district for tuition. And so the university's response to that was to tear down the graduate student housing and to push them off campus. And so there clearly is a need for graduate student housing. In UNH's expansion plans, it's all rests upon expanding their graduate programs, particularly their research facilities, but they haven't provided any housing for them. And as I said, the per unit rental model drives up the cost and it boxes out those very students.
My next question addresses that very subject. And again, I speak here from personal experience. The way it worked in the neighborhood I lived in was that each apartment had its own lease, not each room, not each person, each apartment. And the leases ran from September 1st through August 30th. So they were yearly leases, not school year leases. And the way it worked was one person in the apartment held the lease, and everybody else, the other 3 or 4 people, however many it was, paid their rent to the person who held the lease, who paid the rent to the landlord. Couldn't that also be done in, say, Durham? And wouldn't that solve some of the problems of raising up the cost and having this odd school year lease issue?
So yes, that would solve the problem. The difficulty is that as a municipality, we don't have the ability to enforce a lease agreement between a tenant and a building owner. And so as I said, the crux of the real problem that we're having is the lease structure of that undergraduate housing. And we really are trying to work around it. Ironically enough, as we looked at the workforce zones that we want to build, one of the groups that we've identified that we really want are healthcare workers. And so UNH students, particularly those that have LNAs or LPNs that are working their way through, there's developers that really want to build housing for them because they need them to expand their medical services. And so what they do is like they have a work requirement if you're working for them, that even regardless of what any other thing, that's what really gets you into the housing. So the leasing really is, as you mentioned, the crux of the issue.
And has the town administration considered working with landlords to change the lease structure to something closer to a standard lease structure that, as you said, would solve some of the problems?
Well, of course, it's investors that are buying in, and changing that lease structure, of course, reduces the return that the investor gets on his property. And so they really do not want to do that. Actually, we had a discussion on the Housing Task Force. There is a member of a large rental complex. And believe it or not, with declining enrollment, there has been a softening of the student rental market. And so the question is, how do you convert those right along your lease line? How do you convert those units back from the per bed model to a traditional model to actually capture, again, workforce and graduate student housing? And so we don't have a great answer to that yet.
Last question. You referred to problems of noise and so forth with student housing. And here again, I speak from personal experience. I'll just be real brief. The noise problem where I lived did not come from any students. It came, excuse the expression, from unhappy marriages. We heard them yelling at each other all night long. So my question is, aren't there other noise problems and other trash problems that are not caused by students?
For sure, but not to the extent of students. I do not want to sit here and bash students because they are a great part of Durham and they make us what is special. It's really alcohol mixed with students that creates a great deal of problems. And that demographic particularly is where the issue lies. And that's why we also implemented a community police officer. that when, I mean, again, our police chief said you're not going to arrest your way out of the problem. And I think that's what we strongly believe. We don't want to harm people that are coming to our community before they have a chance to fully grow up. And so the community police officer, what they do is the day after they come, they talk to the students and work with them. And again, the large complexes that are well managed along with the ADUs, we've had really no problems. They've worked out really well.
Thank you.
Representative Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier you referenced nuisance housing. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you mean by nuisance housing?
Well, it's right along this noise. Unfortunately, some houses run on a different time schedule that families do. And so when it's like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning and you have a stereo blasting, that's the noise problem. Trash, I would welcome any of you to come to Durham on a Sunday morning and take a ride along with our police on like a Friday or Saturday night, or come around Saturday morning and look, and you'll see there's like beer cans strewn everywhere. And a lot of those houses are sitting right next to a middle school, so it disrupts our middle school. Those are the two things that we really have faced repeatedly.
If I could follow up, how long has UNH been a school?
I probably should have that by
few
heart,
hundred
but
years,
at least
right?
100 years.
Yeah, so any family that decided to purchase a home near a school understands that with a school comes students. I guess I'm confused with, like, the property owner purchased the property near the school. They had to know that that was one of the reasons or one of the nuisances of buying a property near a school, right?
For sure. I mean, obviously, when you move to Durham, you know it's a college campus, but we as a municipality don't say, I'm sorry, you're out of luck. The whole point of like zoning is that you're supposed to try to address issues that are occurring. And so what we tried to do is resolve it by putting, and by the way, the other thing that's lost in there is not just nuisances, it's student safety. When you mix alcohol and students, there can be some very serious consequences that come along with it. And so by putting students in a more appropriate place that are better supervised, it really is to the safety element of the students. And so, again, just saying, I'm sorry, we didn't know that your property would flood or that you'd have students and you're out of luck is generally not the way that we try to work as a municipality.
Okay. Representative Damon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for helping us understand this. I have two questions. So first of all, you spoke about, I believe, Hanover having a broader definition of unrelated. So what is the definition of unrelated, and what are the different definitions?
So I'll have to send you the actual definitions, but the large part was it worked in the lease. Somebody was there 12 months, not 11 months. And then I can't remember the particulars, but in essence, what it was doing was stripping off that students from non-students. It's a little vague, but I have to come back.
It would be
to
great
that.
if you could send it. Thank you.
Yeah.
And second question.
Follow up.
So this is a completely different question. I was puzzled by your statement about Oyster River Cooperative School District, which is a public school district, charging residents of a community in the district tuition. Do I have that right?
You do have that right. So since it is the issue is if you live on university property, the university does not pay property taxes to the municipality. And since we're a cooperative, we cannot say, you know what, we're going to let this fly, because Lee and Madbury would say, well, that's not fair in the apportionment of the students. So as a result, if you live on private university property, the university is responsible for the tuition.
Clarification?
Follow up.
So just to clarify or extend my understanding of that, so employees or grad students or whoever living on the UNH property who have school-age children access public school because the state university pays the tuition, and otherwise they wouldn't have access to public school.
They would if they lived off campus, but if they live on campus, they don't.
We learn something every day. Okay. Representative Reed.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and thank you again for taking my question. I also, by the way, not related to my question directly, would like the definition of unrelated because I was wondering the same thing, and I'm thinking, well, really, aren't we all related in some way? So our larger family of man, and I'm interested in how that is defined. But my question is, and it's kind of a twofold question. It's what is the difference between? Because as I hear you saying you don't want to disparage students, I'm also hearing how all of these ordinances are very tailored towards students and restricting students, and students are the problem, and students have worse behavior, and we're worried about student behavior. Whether it's, you're trying to get around the lease terms to directly, deal with the fact that they are students, or are they related to deal with the fact that they're students, is all by admission very much geared towards students, that demographic. And so my question is, what's the difference between singling out that demographic and singling out any other demographic that might statistically have different behaviors, broadly speaking? So, for example, what's the difference between saying, well, we want to target students because they have problematic behavior, and we want to target a particular religion or a particular ethnicity because they have certain cultural behaviors? Because to me, it sounds a little cringe, if you forgive the expression, that we are admitting that we want to target students, a particular demographic. So what's the difference?
So I did mention that we're a university town, right? So in a university town, if you ask students where do you want to live, they want to live close to campus. And so again, in terms of targeting students, we built 2,000 units of student housing. We built the housing where students wanted, where best fit the students. And so what we're trying to do, the idea is open up other housing to the groups that we've identified that couldn't get housing, regardless of ethnicity, sex, or anything else you would put in there. What we're really defining it as is workers, graduate students, people that could not afford that per bed unit. And so instead of in saying that we're targeting students or that we're trying to hold off on that is actually the data doesn't show that. That is why we did build housing. We built it where it really fit, where it worked with the university.
Follow up.
Thank you. And I wasn't at all casting aspersions. I was using your own words when you were trying to explain what related meant. You said specifically you were trying to aim at students in the ordinance. That's what you had said. So that's why I repeated that. My second part of this, what is the difference question, is if you buy a house, as was mentioned, in a student town, in a university town, you know that you're buying a property and there's students around, that's going to be a trade-off. What are the benefits to living near a college? And there are many benefits to living near a college. What are the con side? How is that different than buying anywhere else? If I buy a house in a rural area, the pro is it's a beautiful rural area. The con is I might have to commute further. There may not be as many services available to me, et cetera, et cetera. If I buy in a city, just the opposite. The pro is I have lots of services, public transit, you name it, but there may not be as much space. So what is the difference between accepting the trade-off in buying in a different area, wherever you're going, there's a trade-off, and buying in a university? It's a trade-off. You know the trade-off when you buy that property. What's the difference?
So the difference is that it's more difficult to buy a house where we are because an investor will box you out. Since the investor can rent per occupant, they're able to get a really high return on it, and so they'll pay cash, and you'll have difficulty buying that house. And so what we've seen is investors have been buying up all the single-family houses that sit on the border of the university, and that really boxes out most homeowners from buying them.
Yeah. Well, that's all.
And I do appreciate what you just brought up because and this is very broadly on the housing issue in general. My point has been, while we do need to deal with supply very desperately, supply is not the only solution here because Durham is my example. Where it's been built, it hasn't necessarily brought down costs. Supply alone does not fix the problem. And I think you pinpointed a large other piece of the problem, which is investors and what they have done in terms of buying up housing. So my question is, does it not make a lot more sense to target that behavior, investor behavior, large corporate landlord behavior, rather than penalize the students by saying that they can't live in a bedroom with their whoever?
So thank you for the question. So that's the beauty of the workforce overlay district. We can use density when an investor comes to us, and we have an investor that's really interested in a 117-acre parcel that would give us over 200 units. And we can say to the investor, you know what? We'll give you greater density. We'll push down that per occupant square footage. But in trade-off, we're going to ask for a percentage to be in workforce for perpetuity. And that's better even than the Invest New Hampshire money that came in, which is only 5 years, which is too short. And so the workforce opportunity clause in 79E is about 30% that it pushes in. This, we're actually trying to go much higher. So to deal with investors, again, we're trying to use the carrot rather than stick, I guess, is the approach.
Okay, thank you. Representative Gibbs.
Thank you. I guess this is really a follow-up to one of my earlier questions. And I have to admit here that in spite of actually being a lawyer, I'm not sure how this would work legally. But it occurs to me that if you are able to control the number of unrelated people living in a unit, might it not be possible to control something about the way the leases work? That is, that control how the lease would work, and the lease being per unit rather than per bedroom or per occupant. And that, again, as you mentioned earlier, might solve a lot of your problems.
Well, that's a good question. So again, the way that you're able to control the occupancy really is by the definition. So 4 to 16 that are unrelated, that are sharing a kitchen, it's not a single family house anymore by definition in your zoning table. It becomes a lodging house. And so we're able to control occupancy because we're able to control what we allow in certain zones. The lease, I have to say I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot speak to that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Ben Frost from New Hampshire Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee members. I'm Ben Frost. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Legal Officer at New Hampshire Housing. I'm here to speak in support of the amendment 1482 to Senate Bill 527. There's been an awful lot said about this bill, so I'll just make a few additional points. This is a question of means of addressing an issue. And I would submit to you that the way that some communities are attempting to address this issue is potentially unconstitutional and probably definitely a violation of state law against discrimination. And I speak in particular with regard to the questions of familial status and marital status. RSA 354A, which is the state's anti-discrimination law, addresses these two issues, and as well as a variety of other classes of peoples who are protected against discrimination. But it says that there shall be no discrimination on the basis of familial status or marital status. And these words are either indirectly or directly referred to in the amendment on line 15. Familial or non-familial relationships, marital status. In my view, it is not the business of the government, including municipalities, to decide who should be occupying a bedroom, whether they're unrelated or married. That is a private matter. When it comes to discrimination, there are exceptions. So there are bases for the government to act in a discriminatory fashion. If, and in these cases where you have these protected classes, if there is a compelling governmental interest and there is not a less restrictive means possible. So maybe there is a compelling governmental interest here. And then maybe that's the safety of the occupants of the structure or something to do with the neighborhood. But there is most certainly a less intrusive means possible. And I think it has already been clearly articulated here this morning. That is enforcement of the fire code. The fire code, the state fire code, RSA 153, addresses occupancy. It addresses how much space people need to safely occupy a dwelling unit. And if these towns that have this concern would just do that, then I think they would find that questions of overcrowding would be addressed, certainly. They also have other means to address the other issues, waste, noise, and I know that they are difficult to enforce. But that does not mean that the difficulty of enforcement of those measures does not entitle them to engage in unlawful discrimination under state law and federal law. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none.
Thank you.
Thank you. Whoop. We do have a question here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. So, the ordinances in Durham, have they ever been tested around this issue?
Yes, Representative DiLorenzo, I believe that the Durham ordinance, or at least an earlier iteration of the Durham ordinance, was tested. I think there was a 1975 case where I think it was Superior Court found that the language that Durham was using, unrelated individuals, and the standards were different at that time in the zoning ordinance, did not afford protection to the challengers because they were resting on the familial status protection, and they were not a family under law. So they didn't get that protection. This language is much clearer in this amendment because it refers to familial or non-familial relationships and marital status. So, and I think it was Representative Power who gave a couple of really great illustrative examples. You know, two unmarried couples cannot live together in the same apartment in Durham because they're not related.
Follow up. So, when I think about family status, as per HUD, it's a family is a group of people that want to live together to, you know, cohabit, and that's it. It doesn't talk about, you know, relationships. So I'm sort of like drawing that as an analogy to what I feel should be the law. Thank you.
Yeah,
I agree.
okay. Okay.
Mr. Frost, what town do you live in?
I live in the town of Warner.
Warner. Okay. Are you aware when you purchased the do you own a property?
I do.
Are you aware that there's a college near Warner and that you might have students living near you?
There was a college in Warner. It closed recently.
Yes.
And I was certainly aware of it. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Representative Gibbs.
Thank you. I hesitate to appear to contradict you on this, but it happens to be an issue that I'm particularly familiar with, and that involves the definition of familial status under both state and federal law. And that is familial status. I'm looking here at the text of RSA 354A.
I have it here too, Representative.
Sorry?
I have it here too, Representative.
And it refers to individuals who have not attained the age of 18, who have not attained the age of 18 years of age, domiciled with a parent, grandparent, or another person having legal custody. And it goes on to cover someone who is pregnant or in the process of obtaining legal custody. The point being that it refers to families with children rather than general familial status, the status of being unrelated. Now, state law also covers marital status, which federal law does not. So that gives you a little more of a handle there under state law. But I just thought it was important to point that out.
Representative Gibbs, I agree with you completely, and I have read that definition in RSA 354A, and that's why I think the inclusion of the term marital status on line 15 is very important.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
that's it. Thank you. Alyssa Margoli from Housing Action. In support of the bill.
Thank you, Representative Baroudi, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Alyssa Margolin. I serve as Director of Housing Action New Hampshire, and we are here in support of the Amendment 1482H to Senate Bill 527, and want to thank Representative Power for bringing this forward and her advocacy on this important issue. This committee has done a tremendous job in documenting the real suffering experienced by Granite Staters due to the housing crisis. Some of that suffering has come through in testimony because of struggles to stay in the state as a young person. Other people have talked about being the parent of adult children with disabilities. Others have told you about how business and economic growth is suffering. And this committee has done a good job in identifying legislative proposals to ameliorate the situation for our state. The members of my organization, Housing Action New Hampshire, are on the front lines of this crisis. They are trying to problem solve this. They are the developers. They are the financiers of affordable housing properties. They're the supportive housing providers for those who need services in addition to their housing. And they are using every tool available that the state makes available, that municipalities may make available to solve this crisis. When they are hitting a barrier, where are they supposed to go? They are supposed to go to the lawmakers to ask them for relief, to say, thank you for these tools. However, we are still unable to provide this housing. And so they are asking for you to improve the law so that they can help solve a very serious crisis. We view this amendment as one of those places where it's important to come to state lawmakers in particular. And while the efforts at many municipalities, including some of them mentioned today, have been impressive and a real commitment to addressing the crisis, there are still places where there remains bias and barriers in need of a state lawmaker's scrutiny and support. And so with that, we ask you to consider making an important step in this direction and passing this, recommending it for passage. I do want to also name something about home share for people aging or desiring to age in place. New Hampshire does not yet have a strong home share program, and in many times it's because they're battling local ordinances like this one. They would like to create programs where people who are unrelated could help an aging person stay in their home. And there are examples in other states where this has been successful. Our attempts yet in New Hampshire are kind of non-starters, and I think that passing this would be important foundationally for helping us launch some of these home share programs in the state. And with that, I'll conclude.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Seeing none. Notch Graves from New Hampshire Municipal Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And H. Grace for the Municipal Association. We do oppose this this non-germane amendment. I do want to note, because I know some of you also serve on municipal and county government, and that when the original bill, House Bill 1281 came up, we did not have a position on that bill. However, we were provided further information from affected communities, including Durham, who you've heard about extensively today, as well as Lebanon and Hanover, all of whom have submitted written testimony as well. And as a result, we are opposing this non-germane amendment. I do want to note that I am not familiar with the particularities of Durham's zoning ordinance or how that interacts with state law. I am aware that the town planner is sitting behind me waiting to testify, so I would ask to defer questions to him if you have those specific questions. I just want to note that this would be a statewide mandate that would overrule the decisions of local communities. You've heard extensively from Durham about how they have attempted to balance the interests of various parties within their community. I understand that not everyone agrees with how they've chosen to do that, but it is important, and I think that the very extensive testimony illustrates that these are very complicated issues that don't have a single solution, that obviously require a lot of input, a lot of thought, and Durham has clearly done that. As a result, they have created a series of ordinances that interact, that attempt to balance the interests of who needs housing in their community, promote housing in a way that allows kind of equity across the board. And that's what we've seen in other communities with other definitions and other variations of this. And that's exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about non-permanent type of housing as for students. And so it's really more appropriate to deal with that at the local level, as they can tailor that to kind of the needs of the individual communities, both the permanent residents coming forward, as well as the colleges, universities, other student-based entities, and talk about what will work, what can be supported by those entities, as well as what's needed from the community, and have that free flow of information rather than putting in place a statewide mandate that is going to force significant changes to a number of communities across the state. Happy to take any questions that the committee may have.
Okay, thank you. Any
Thank you.
questions? All right, Jay Goulds? We have your written testimony here,
Thank you. I may digress a little bit, just
and
listening to some
you're
of the
opposed to the bill.
other testimony, but thank you for listening to me, members of the committee. My name is Jay Goose. I've lived in Durham since 1978. Actually 77, but I live in the same street since 1978. And it is very close to proximity to everything with the university. I walk downtown now. I took a 2-mile walk all around the campus this morning. So I'm very familiar with being close to the campus. I was a volunteer physician for the hockey team for 40 years. Retired a few years ago from that. And I have very good friends who are students. Some of them still contact me after all these years. So I'm a fan of the University of New Hampshire. But I am testifying today in opposition to the amendment that was added to Senate Bill 527 concerning a minimum of 2 renters per bedroom. This amendment, I do not believe, is an effective way to deal with New Hampshire's affordable housing problem. And I'm really hoping at the end of my testimony, you'll take into consideration that we are trying in Durham to address this issue. And to do it with this way would tremendously impact, and I'll explain why. Durham, by the will of the people, placed reasonable constraints on the number of renters in our single-family homes. When I first moved to Durham, many single-family homes were owned by faculty of the university and the local school system because it was affordable to buy and live in those houses. Shortly after my family moved here, investors found that buying houses and renting to as many university students as possible provided an excellent return on their investment, especially if the investor minimized maintenance and upkeep expenses. Soon, home affordability for families began to disappear as the landlords renting by the bed could outbid families for the properties. Once a house in a residential neighborhood became a student rental, now I can use this term, student rental. I was involved with drafting the ordinance in 1986 for the 3 unrelated. And I was very specifically told by the attorneys, don't say student. You've got to make it general for unrelated because you can't discriminate against students. So I'm a little bit confused about seeing this amendment which specifically targets students. So for years we were told we could not say students, but it resulted in parties, cars, noise, and trash issues that ensued after these homes were bought by these investors. One of the many, and I'm going to get personal, one of the many examples of this was when the house across from us was rented to 5 students while my daughter was recovering from major lung surgery. Constant noise related to the lifestyle of students ensued. Calling the police for ongoing problems of drunken shouting and car doors slamming at 1, 2, 3 a.m. did not help, as often the issue ended before the police arrived, leaving my daughter and us disturbed throughout the night. Other residents in our neighborhood were dealing with drunk students trespassing near their house while shouting, urinating, and worse. Again, calling the police did no good because try as they might to be helpful, the perpetrators had moved on. Once the house across from us was deemed to fall under our ordinance, it has been occupied with one owner or a family in the main house and 1 to 2 students or a family in the ADU. There have been no problems with this arrangement. Students living in Durham for 2 to 3 years do not have the same behavior or lifestyle of working or retired full-time residents. When I was on our town council, I served on the Regional Housing Commission that met in Portsmouth over the course of 2 to 3 years. No matter what plan we came up with, the answer for Durham was always the same. Investors could outbid families for homes because of their ability to rent by the bed at the higher market rates driven by the university. While committed to our families and neighborhoods, Durham has been equally committed to increasing housing for our student residents. Over the past 15 years, our zoning and planning processes have allowed the number of student residents to increase over 130% by adding new, well-managed apartments that can accommodate almost 2,500 students. This amendment will not help affordable housing in Durham or the region. In fact, it will do the opposite by taking affordable housing stock off the market for families and placing it in the hands of investors. When upperclassmen at UNH prefer the independency of living off campus, Durham apartments accommodate them with well-maintained and managed options that compete for their business. These are part of what we have built in the last 5 to 10 years. The university's new requirement that freshmen and sophomores live on campus next year will place more pressure on their professionally managed apartments, and that puts pressure on Durham landlords that have invested over $100 million in Durham housing, and that is why this amendment has been introduced. This amendment will not make housing more affordable, but rather make renting by the bed in single-family homes attractive to investors while displacing families from our neighborhoods. Thank you for that part. I'd like to just add a couple of things because of what has been testified to. Someone said, why would you come to UNH if you knew it was a university? You knew there was going to be problems. Well, when we came, all the houses near the middle school were owned by faculty or owned by just regular residents. All along from where I live to the hockey rink, 6 houses were all family owned. Over the course of the next 5 to 6 years, those houses became bought by investors, and they put in, at that time, as many students as they could. That was why we had to find something to do. And the 3 unrelated rule, at the time that we did it, was legal. Now, whether or not it would be now, I can't tell you. It's never been challenged now, but it did get challenged in the White case, which I think was in 77 or 78. And at that time, they specifically referenced the U.S. Supreme Court in Belterre versus Barras in 1974 that specifically said it was legal for residents to limit occupancy to unrelated, by unrelated. And you can look it up if you'd like. It may not be relevant now. It hasn't been challenged since, but it was legal when we did it. And we were very careful to do this law legally. The other thing is, any investor who has come into Durham since the ordinance was done has known about this ordinance. It was their choice to come in, knowing that they were going to be restricted in terms of what they could rent to. So to have complaints now seems a little bit disingenuous. So I guess that's my testimony. You're welcome to answer any questions.
Thank you. Representative Gibbs.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. This goes back to some of the comments that we had earlier. Might it not be possible to solve the problems that you describe by controlling the investor behavior rather than controlling the relationships of the tenants, and specifically by requiring that the investors, the landlords, rent per unit rather than per bedroom?
As far as I know, certainly we had a rental housing commission that I was a member of, when we had certain landlords that were in that committee, I guess the town committee, along with some of the people in the administration in the town. And I think if those things were mentioned, the landlords wanted no part of it. I don't think legally, I'm not sure exactly, but somebody could tell me. Think that we can legally require them to have a certain type of lease. I know we had difficulty even trying to have inspections done because for the safety of the people renting. We tried to work on that for years, and we were fought all the time by the investors, by the owners. So I can't answer your question as to why. I know we've tried to do everything we can. I can't answer the specific question.
Thank you.
You're
Okay,
welcome.
thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Representative DiCilorenzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question. So speaking about the investor units, what kind are they? I mean, are they buying single-family homes and converting? Are they, stacked buildings or?
No, just regular single-family homes, and typically they might have an ADU with them.
Okay.
And, this has been one of the many things we have tried to do in the town to control our just normal living. Like any one of you people here would not want to be woken up night after night at 2 or 3 in the morning by people just walking by your house shouting, generally inebriated. It didn't used to happen when I first came. And we have it relatively well controlled now. We have a tremendous police force who will come out when they need to. We have a community officer who will go and talk to the houses when there's problems. Of course, next semester, it's like deja vu all over again. Same thing happens. And so this is just one part of the armamentarium of trying to deal with it.
May I follow up, please?
Follow up.
So how many investor units do you think there are in Durham?
How many investors?
How many investor units do you think?
Oh, you know what? I don't have that number. Maybe our planning director has it or our code enforcement officer. I think something like 85 or 90. I believe I saw that number.
85 or 90 investor units?
Yeah. I mean, it may be more. There's a lot of students living. We have 7 houses in our street, and I think 4 of them have ADUs with students, but the owners live there.
So follow up again. So when you look at deeds, in your property tax rolls, are the investors identified as XYZ Inc. or something like that, or?
We can't make them commercial. They have to be just residential. So they are taxed as residential,
Right.
as a certain number of bedrooms, but they rent by the bed.
But are there particular LLCs or corporations that are buying up these places?
There's 3 or 4 landlords that may have more, 2 or 3 units.
Okay.
Yes.
It isn't, so it's really not easy to identify as a widespread.
No, and you never know which one's going to go. I live in fear, and when this was first proposed, I really said to our town administrator, if this happens again and there are 5 or 6 like were across from me before, I will move.
All right.
I cannot live with that. No,
Thank-
none of you could.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Damon.
I'm wondering if, thank you, and thank you for taking my question. I'm wondering if there has been any consideration or perhaps experience of the town becoming the investor and the landlord.
I think everything has been discussed. And if we're not, it's because I don't think that's affordable.
So not affordable to buy it.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. Representative Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question or testimony. I'm concerned when you say normal living because normal to me, what I do at night, like I'm a bartender, so I come home from work at 11 p.m. and I might decide to have 2 or 3 drinks, and then by the time you know it, I'm in bed by 2 a.m. And people that know me know that you really can't contact me before noon if I'm not, like.
Sure.
Would that be considered normal living? That concerns me when you say normal, like it's just a different lifestyle.
I'm talking about a different lifestyle. You have to understand that you come home and you usually, because you're in a neighborhood, sure, you might have had 2 or 3 drinks, but you're not going to come in and shout and scream. And no, typically you won't. I don't think so. Anybody would want that in their neighborhood.
I
Maybe
guess
you
I'm
do.
wondering,
I don't
have
know if
these
you do,
students-
sir, but most people living in the neighborhood would be upset if that was what was going on in their neighborhood. And
Have
that's why
these-
we're
my-
upset when it
My
happens.
concern is, have these students at all violated the health and safety of your own property? At all? Have they violated your safety?
It violated my health.
Okay. I'm going to leave it there.
I know.
Okay.
My
thank you.
mental health.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Michael Barrett is the Durham Town Planner. And he is opposed to the bill.
To the honorable members of the House Special Committee on Housing, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I am speaking in opposition to the amendment proposed for SB 527. I am the town planner for Durham. I have over 30 experience in 4 municipalities as a professional planner and a lot of experience with housing. This amendment would have very detrimental impacts on the cities and towns in New Hampshire that host colleges and universities and on the neighboring communities. I see no benefits from this bill to the public. The benefits would all accrue to a handful of investors who would therefore be able to cram, that's a word you hear a lot in town, cram more undergraduate students into single-family houses rather than 3, 4, 5, 6. Sky's the limit. And make a lot of money, make a huge return at the expense of the neighborhood. Please keep in mind that within neighborhoods, single family, and some of them are mixed. They have single family, they have some duplexes, a lot of ADUs. We love ADUs in Durham because it's usually 1 student or 2, and the owner lives on the premises, keeps an eye on it. I have an ADU. They're wonderful. Well, I'll come back to that. So that's the only benefit that I would see, not to the public, certainly not to the housing situation. I briefly want to respond to a couple of comments that have been made. My colleague Ben Frost, who I know well, I have tremendous respect for. I'm not an attorney, but our town attorney has stated that this is legal. She's very conservative, very experienced in municipal law. And this law of 3 unrelated has been vetted. But even in terms of what Ben says, there is certainly a compelling interest for the town of Durham to have this ordinance in place, and it is by far the most effective. alternatives that have been proposed, there just would not be effective. Some people say, well, why don't you enforce the other laws, you know, cars on lawns, noise ordinance, public drinking, garbage. We try. It still is often an issue, but I want to give you an example as a planner that the value of having an ordinance that avoids a situation that is going to be very problematic. I used to be the planner in Rochester, New Hampshire, and we had we approved a number of home occupations for people to have car maintenance for their homes to make a little extra money. And the owners, we required, it was allowed under our home occupation ordinance, at least by some discretion, always said, I will have one car at a time, always in my garage, always be quiet, no noise, etc. And a number of these home occupations were approved. In a number of cases, it just became a real problem. The property owner had multiple cars. They were on the lawn. They had the garage open. They were noisy. And it was an enforcement nightmare. And once it is set up, it's very, very difficult to enforce. And as Jay Goose said, we have a noise ordinance. The police will come. They're gone. They're inebriated. They've gone home. It's virtually impossible to enforce. The intelligent thing is to have an ordinance that does not give an opening to something that you know is going to be a problem. One question was asked, is this anything to do with morals with couples living together? Absolutely not. I assure you that is not the case. That has never been a consideration. Another question was, well, families buy in town. They know it's a university town. That's true. And they also trust their local government will protect them, protect their quality of life and their property values. And they also know that we have this 3 unrelated rule. And the town works very hard to manage trash, noise, cars on lots, drunken behavior. We do the best we can. Durham is proud to host the University of New Hampshire. It's an outstanding top public university. Thousands of UNH students live in our town and in Dover, Newmarket, Portsmouth, Somersworth, and Rochester. Managing student housing, especially, we're mainly talking about single-family houses in neighborhoods, is a fundamental and even an existential issue in our town. When we learned about this proposal, people were terrified in our community about the devastating impact this would have on Durham, on Hanover, on Plymouth, on Keene, and to some degree on Manchester. We are holding a tiger by the tail. We love our students, but the situation causes numerous problems. Evaluating the impacts is an ongoing matter of discussion, frequently deliberated by the town council, the planning board, the conservation commission, the energy committee, the historic district commission, and by our housing task force and the staff. We delve into the myriad details related to student housing to maintain Durham as a beautiful, diverse, well-run town while also respecting the rights and concerns of students. We love our students. Student housing is a major industry and taxpayer in town. The town approaches the issue in good faith with much analysis and input from the university, our partner, landlords, and residents, especially those who live in neighborhoods. This proposed law would undermine that process. Host communities are in the best position to make these decisions. Unlike workforce housing, where there is a huge recognized need and countless challenges to its development, it doesn't pay for itself. We are wrestling with this, how to promote workforce housing in an expensive town like Durham. Student housing does not need an assist. They do just fine, thank you very much. At $1,400 a bed, they're doing just fine. They do not need any help. The students do not need help. The landlords do not need help. Students' rights to housing are not being infringed upon. Student housing brings in millions of dollars in tax revenues and revenue and supports our local businesses. It would be impossible and foolish for us to try to restrict this use. As has been mentioned, most housing developments are rented by the bed. Students can pay that. If a 3-bedroom apartment or a single-family house for students rents for $4,000, say $1,350 a bed, then families will never be able to go there. And the thing to keep in mind is within a neighborhood, and we have lots of neighborhoods, primarily single family, but they're wonderful mixed historic neighborhoods, as I say, duplexes, triplexes, other apartments. One problem house will destroy a street. That's just the reality of it. So, we can talk about in very theoretical terms about rights. But how about balancing the rights? And again, one problem house will destroy a street. And our ordinances are not very helpful. And the fact of the matter is that Durham and other communities have hit upon the simplest, direct, most effective way to address that. And that is a maximum 3 related. It doesn't always work, but it's extremely effective. There is a correlation in a house between the number of students and the likelihood of having problems. The more the students, the more likely you'll have problems. With 3, it seems to be kind of a magic number. In most cases, it works really well. Just a few more comments, if I may. So addressing undergraduate student life off campus is a highly particular and complicated issue. It must be worked through by each municipality based upon the individual character of the school and the community. What is being proposed is a very, very blunt instrument, which is not attending at all to the particular characteristics of the half a dozen towns that wrestle with this every single day. Adopting this amendment will be damaging not only to Durham and the other college towns, but also to the colleges and our flagship university, UNH in particular. Our town-gown relationship is excellent. Much of that's due to our outstanding town administrator and a series of excellent presidents of UNH. We've been very fortunate. We have excellent relations. We communicate with them at every level. And one of the major issues is addressing student housing. And we are in line. The university supports our rule. And I want to tell you that if this ordinance goes through, that will damage UNH, our flagship university, because town-gown relations will suffer. It will engender ill will in the community. Many residents, longtime residents, will be very angry. They'll be angry at UNH. They won't shop downtown. They'll badmouth UNH. And that will affect the university. Image and brand is very important. And this will impact our flagship university's ability to recruit faculty and students in the highly competitive environment in which all colleges are now operating. The town of Durham is highly engaged in addressing the affordable housing crisis. I serve as staff to the Durham Housing Task Force, whose mission it is to promote housing options and affordable housing. And I want to say I am also on the board of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Seacoast, New Hampshire. So this issue is very close to my heart. I've spoken about housing numerous times, but and the Workforce Housing Coalition is not taking a position on this, and I am speaking as myself. Not for the Workforce Housing Coalition. I bring that up only because of to show my commitment to this issue, and I respect the representative from Housing Action, but I firmly disagree. I enthusiastically support certain thoughtful mandates from the state regarding housing that are needed. An ADU statute was passed 5 or so years ago, and that was great. That was a mandate because communities were in my opinion, irresponsibly not allowing ADUs. ADUs are great. You know, it's not going to hurt your neighborhood. They're well managed. And if your community's not allowing them, the state should come in and make you do it. The state did that. That was an excellent statute. There's another statute about ADUs taking that further. I applaud that effort. That is appropriate. It's been vetted and discussed with all the stakeholders. But this proposal is in no way comparable. This has not been vetted. We are the experts in Durham and Hanover, Plymouth and Keene. Nobody spoke to us about it. My understanding is 2 landlords showed up at a public hearing. Frankly, 2 landlords who have had a number of run-ins with the town because of not respecting some of our ordinances. And we were not even aware when this thing came forward. So that was very upsetting for us to learn about this after the fact. As a professional town planner with over 30 years of experience, I do think that I am somewhat of an expert in the housing issue, and I will assure you that this proposal will not help our housing situation. It will undercut those efforts, again, because of a single-family house, rather than being attractive and having opportunities for families of moderate income. Nobody will be able to compete when the rent is $6,000 from 6 students in there. This is a fundamental issue for Durham and for other college towns. Please respect our community's longstanding good faith efforts to deal with this challenging local matter. And please direct important efforts toward workforce housing in other areas that will be effective, and please find this bill inexpedient to legislate. Thank you.
Representative Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here and testifying. You spoke a little bit about how the relationship between the school and the town are very good, correct? I mean, but I'm looking at like this resolution by the Student Senate that they put out last month, and it literally says at the end, to condemn the tone of the Town Council of Durham and claim that the students are separate residential enclave of Durham and cannot be co-inhabit traditional residential communities. And it says earlier in it that they believe that you're implying that students in the town of Durham are separate constituencies and do not necessitate equal housing considerations. I guess what I'm saying is like the Student Senate opposes it or is in favor of this, but the town is against it. What if all the students voted in town elections? That ordinance would go right away.
We welcome our students to vote, and we welcome them to sit on town boards. There's some very young people on the planning board and on the town council now. We're very pleased about. Well, you know, I can't speak for the person. I think that if the majority, the majority of students are not informed about the issue. They're not sensitive to, issues in neighborhoods for families. I think that the officials at UNH would certainly support us. And I think if many students who are thoughtful, if they had an opportunity to sit down and talk with me and other town officials, and we could talk about the issue, I think many of them would support the provisions we have in place. For whatever reason, I think some students, probably the president of the Senate, some other supporters, may feel some alienation because this is a big issue. We have had some projects where there were student housing proposed that people were very upset about, where a great deal of student housing was proposed in a new development close to a neighborhood. And I think there was some alienation there. But generally, we have excellent relations with students. They see it differently. Most of them are living in student developments or on campus. They are not attuned to the problems. I live in a single family house in Durham, and I've had people come by at 3 a.m. screaming, inebriated. Most students are wonderful. We love our students. Our town would dry up without UNH. But we are holding a tiger by the tail. We have to manage this. And this is legal. It is appropriate where we are drawing the line at families, and they could be up to 10 people, versus unrelated and unrelated when you have 4 or more, not always, but in many cases in a single family neighborhood, when they're inebriated on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday night, they don't behave well. It's oil and water. Many of them are wonderful. But the odds of it happening with an unrelated household, which in Durham is going to be undergraduate students, is vastly greater. And isn't that what we do in policy? We set our policy based on costs and benefits and probabilities. So yes, some families behave badly. Many students behave wonderfully, but there is a very clear correlation, and this is therefore we believe it's effective policy.
Okay, follow up.
It seems to me the policy you put in place benefits 33% at the expense to 66% of the residents of your town.
Well, who is it hurting?
Student rents, like the price of housing.
Most students, not affected on campus. We have thousands of units in large student housing developments that are wonderful. It's mainly affecting people in houses in neighborhoods and the landlords who wish that they could rent to 5 or 6 kids. I'm just not aware of many students. There's probably some students that, 4 or 5 of them would love to rent a house in a neighborhood. They could go to Dover. There's many other housing opportunities. I think those situations are rare. Also, by the way, this has no effect on fraternities and boarding houses. They're not affected by this ordinance.
Representative Givens.
Thank you. You've mentioned several times what you believe that the views of students are, and you mentioned earlier during your testimony that you asked for input from residents, but did you ask for input from student organizations? Because it does seem to me, and here I speak as someone who, as a graduate student, lived in a neighborhood that was about half families and half students in a single unit that had 4 students living together, and later on in a house that had 5 people, some of them working, some of them students living together, because that was the most workable and affordable type of housing that we could find. So it does seem to me that the people who would be harmed by not passing this amendment would not only be the investors, but would also be those students who need to find housing in groups, which students almost always do if they need to live off campus. So back to my question, sorry for going on a bit. Did you ask for input from student organizations?
Well, our ordinance has been in place for many years, so we haven't, needed to have a dialogue about it. It's been in place and it's functioned well. But the dialogue that is ongoing in the community is about general zoning and housing issues. And I speak with students and other stakeholders all the time, members of fraternities, people in houses, certainly our code enforcement officer does. So, I think we have a pretty good sense of the world that we operate in. And again, it's everything is a trade-off. So I believe the very small number of groups of 4 or 5 or 6 that would like to live together in a house that cannot do that in Durham versus the benefits of limiting 3. I just see the cost benefit like this. There's so many options for students. I know there's some students that struggle. We have homeless students in Durham. We have students that are living in their cars, which is very upsetting, but that has to do with very tragic family dynamics, nothing to do with this. But the trade-off seems clear to us, and there are so many options, again, with ADUs, on-campus housing, renting in Dover where they don't have this rule, or Newmarket or Rochester, and in housing developments off campus.
Well, the ability to rent in Dover, may I do a follow-up?
Sorry.
Wouldn't the ability to rent in Dover be dependent upon transportation, which not all students have?
Right.
So
but there are many options overall for students.
But back to my original question, you mentioned during your testimony that you have requested input. And I don't know when you were referring to, whether it was when you originally passed the ordinance or more recently. It sounds like more recently you have been specifically requesting input from residents. You can tell me if I'm wrong. So when you did that, did you request input from students? And I speak in reference to the Student Senate resolution that Representative Alexander referenced.
Well, again, the input is not regarding our ordinance because that has been in place a long time. The input is in my daily job, dealing with planning, zoning, and housing, people that come in to talk with me, general issues when we reach out to the broad community, all the stakeholders, including the UNH officials and students, undergraduate and graduate. So nothing. And then we also, our housing task force, has reached out a lot, has had a major outreach effort to stakeholders about housing in general. We've gotten input from UNH administrators, town employees, firefighters, teachers, graduate students, some undergraduates that we were able to contact. So, you know, I suspect probably many undergraduate students from their point of view, if they learn about this ordinance, they'd say, gee, I don't like that, but it's not really affecting them. They probably are not sensitized to the issue. Yeah, many probably would not like it, just on the idea of it. But again, in terms of cost benefit, what's really happening on the ground, you know.
Okay, thank you. You have a question? Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have three quick ones, if that's okay.
Yep.
First one, regarding this Senate resolution. Anybody know how many of the senators in UNH own a home?
Oh,
I would
okay.
guess none, but you don't have to answer that.
Oh, well, I probably, you know, none of them on their own, but
Right,
there's
exactly.
there's a lot of historically undergraduate students when they come to Durham, usually as a freshman, their savvy parent will buy a house, and the student, I think they have to live on campus freshman year and now sophomore year, but they'll buy a house at some point. The child will live there with roommates, and then the parent may keep it or they'll sell it years later, usually at a pretty good profit. That's one of the issues, you know, that's one of the kinds of investors that we have.
And as my next question, I believe it was mentioned, but I just want to clarify from my notes. What year was the ordinance in Durham adopted?
I don't know.
I heard
with the-
70s. Three unrelated, yeah. 86? Thank you. And I have one more. How many other towns or cities in New Hampshire have a three unrelated ordinance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know exactly the representative that presented this. I think she mentioned 8 municipalities. I don't know that. I do know that Hanover. I'm often in contact with planners in Hanover, Plymouth, and Keene, to a lesser extent Manchester, comparing notes about the ordinances and policies that they have to manage this issue. So it's a little different in every community, but everybody wrestles with it in their own way.
Thank you.
Okay, is that it? Okay, I only have one comment. I know that there's a lot of colleges and a couple of universities in New Hampshire. I'm wondering why Durham and UNH are the only ones that showed up to even say anything today.
Well, we have had some email connection with, I think you got a letter from somebody, it might have been the town manager from Hanover. And that I don't know. You know, people are busy. We've had some email exchanges. Durham was pretty vocal in our email. Maybe they assumed that we were taking the lead on it. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Mr.
So-
Chair?
Oh, one more?
Yeah,
Sir.
actually, question to the chair. Could it be because this is the second time this has been heard?
Maybe. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. And we got one card left, Audrey
Thank
Claire
you very
from
much. Can I
Town of
hand
Durham.
something out? Should here? Okay. I got.
Opposed. Last but not least, we saved the best for last.
You did indeed.
Hi, thank you. I wasn't necessarily intending to speak today, but I think I need to. My name is Audrey Klein. I'm the code enforcement officer in Durham. I'm also the building inspector, the health inspector, and I don't catch dogs, but I'm waiting for that. So I'm responsible for all the zoning enforcement, all the building code enforcement, and health laws in Durham. I want to just start out by giving you some information based on some of the questions I heard earlier. And if you have any other questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them. So these are kind of some factual backup to some of the questions. One of the questions that a representative asked was, wasn't Durham applying the 3 unrelated illegally already because of the accessory dwelling unit with the single family dwelling? And the state law the state law 67472 for accessory dwelling units, number 4, states that any municipal regulation applicable to single-family dwellings shall also apply to the combination of principal dwelling and ADU. So it's permitted in the recent ADU regulation that the current laws can apply to both units. And that's exactly what happens in Durham today, is that the 3 unrelated regulation was in place for single families, and therefore it is in place for the ADU plus the single family. I just wanted to make it clear that we're not breaking any laws by enforcing that at this point. I wanted to also back up what Michael was saying. Well, we don't regulate by who's sleeping in what bed or how many beds there are. You can have a 1-bedroom apartment and have 3 unrelated people. We don't have any regulation or anything to think or say about that at all. So it's not a matter of bedroom. Having said that, there's no distinction between a bedroom and any other room in a house. Unless you're talking about a house on a private septic system where the system by DES calls out how many bedrooms that house is allowed to have. If you're on town water and sewer, any room is a bedroom. And I've seen it many times that in a traditional home, the formal living room and the formal dining room are now bedrooms because people are using them as bedrooms. So I don't know how we would even identify how many bedrooms a house had in this proposal, because I sometimes fall asleep in the bathtub, but is that a bedroom? I don't know. Going to the fire code that Ben Frost was discussing, the fire code is only restricted to no less than 200 square feet per person. So my home is 1,500 square feet. That could hold 7 individuals. I can't say I haven't sometimes had 7 relatives at my house, but I know that young people have very active social lives. They have friends and partners, and 7 people really means 20 people in my experience in a lot of cases on many nights in Durham. I was taking notes as we were going, so you have to excuse me a minute. An unrelated household, the question was, what is Durham's definition for that? And that is a household of more people related within a second degree of kinship by civil law or marriage or adoption or foster care. I don't know what the civil law is for unmarried couples living together, whether they're considered married or not. But the second degree of relation is spouse, children, parents, brothers, sisters, half-brothers, grandchildren, and grandparents. The third level would include aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, great grandparents. So there is definition for what the levels of kinship are, and Durham's ordinance says with the second degree of kinship. As been mentioned, there is a Supreme Court case that has the decision that it is legal to restrict people by their familial or related status, and that is the Fisher versus New Hampshire State Building Code Review case, which actually was in Durham. There were two cases. One was very early on, I think in the 50s, but then again in the 80s, and the Supreme Court did rule that it was not discriminatory to have the regulation that Durham had at the time. To go on to some, just a couple of points that aren't in strict law, since I do the enforcement, I actually see a lot of other situations that haven't been discussed here because we've been talking about the word students. And just like with any enforcement, there's a prioritization system that one has to follow because we only have a certain amount of resources. So if you look at a state trooper on the highway, most people are going 65, 70, maybe a little over the speed limit. But that state trooper has to look at who he's going to or she is going to pull over. And they're going to look at the car that's swerving in between lanes, speeding, throwing trash out the window, or other activities that raise it above the average violation, so to speak. And that's true with the enforcement that we do for the activities that happen in these three unrelated or any other property in town. If there isn't some impact that's impacting or visible, then I probably won't even know that there's three unrelated or not. So I'm enforcing the most impactful violations of the ordinance. And that's not always students. We have some that are, there was mentioned, there's families that fight. There's families that have trashy lawns and park on their lawns. So it's a matter of the level of the violation, not who lives there. So we're not focusing the regulation on students. It is true that young people are out there the first time, probably away from home. They need some guardrails to understand what it means to live on their own in a community. And we talk with them regularly on a informal basis, every semester, every year when new young people move into town. We talk with them about what the expectation is for their trash, for their parking, for their activities in town, and before it ever gets to any kind of formal enforcement. Many opportunities for them to learn what the expectations are, and often when I'm enforcing households that are not occupied by young people, they also have to come into compliance. So it just so happens that the young people households are still learning how to do it. So they tend to be more out of compliance on a regular basis than some other households. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Representative Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are you telling me that you more strictly enforce student housing than opposed to other residents of Durham?
No, I think I
Based
was
on-
saying that I don't more strictly enforce them, that I actually enforce them. I enforce the level of violation, not necessarily the individual people that live in the house.
Okay. And then my other question is, we talked a little bit about order of kinship, third degree. So you're talking like aunt, uncle, that sort of thing is third degree kinship. So that third degree based on your definition of kinship, third degree kinship, if there's four people that are related within 3 degrees, they wouldn't be allowed to live together because you would have, so say if like an aunt wanted to adopt their nephew or niece and have them live in the same house as them, otherwise they'd be homeless. Based on your ordinance, they wouldn't be allowed to do that, or are you allowed to enforce the ordinance for students but not the ordinance for the aunt that wants to adopt their nephew? I
The
guess I'm
ord-
wondering,
the-
like,
the-
do you
the-
discriminate? Do you enforce one ordinance for one group of people over an ordinance for another group of people in town? That's what I'm asking.
No, I approach the enforcement of of the ordinances and the violation based on the level of impact or the amount of violation that's going on, given the amount of time I have to enforce. So, if there was a household with an aunt who's adopting her best friend's child, for instance, unless that household is also very visibly violating the ordinance, first of all, I would never know. Second of all, they can have up to 2 unrelated people. So in that case, that wouldn't necessarily make it a violation.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Representative Gibbs.
Thank you. Just a comment, first of all, and that is that someone who was in the process of adopting a child, that would come under both federal and state familial status law. So that would also be helpful there. But the question that I wanted to ask, and thank you for taking it, you mentioned earlier that the 3 unrelated rule could legally be applied to the main unit plus the ADU. And I'm not sure how that would work. That is, suppose I rent a house with a roommate who is not related to me. And then there's an ADU, and 2 roommates who are unrelated rent that ADU. So that would be 2 unrelated people in the house and 2 unrelated people in the ADU. Would that violate your 3 unrelated ordinance or not?
Yes, it would. Our ordinance and the state law, the ADU state law, which coincides with our ordinance, says that the single family dwelling with an ADU is in many ways treated like a single family dwelling. You don't have to have a larger lot size. There's many things that you would be required to have if you had 2 separate dwelling units that the ADU regulation, the state regulation, doesn't require, because the purpose of it was to make them as readily available as possible, therefore not making 2 separate units. So our local law coincides with the ability to have to apply the 3 unrelated to those 2 units as one unit. So that would be in violation.
Follow up.
I just wanted to mention that appears, what you just specified, that appears to contradict some of the earlier testimony that indicated that the ordinance would not be applied in that way. So I don't know which governs, but I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. As the code enforcement officer, I have to say that I'm 100% correct.
Thank you.
Okay. All set? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That concludes all the testimony today. So we're going to close the hearing now on 527 non-germane amendment. And
Okay,
turn it
thank
back
you.
over to
Thank you,
you
Representative
for
Rudy.
further-
So we had noticed an executive session. We have 3 members absent, so I think I'm going to hold off on that for a week or so. I'm thinking, I know Representative Walsh is ready to vote, but I don't think I'm ready to vote yet. So if you need a sub for the day of the executive session, feel free to let us know and we'll appoint a sub. But I will hold off. I'm thinking either a session day during a lunch that everyone's here, so make it easy, or a Friday. But I will let the committee know. Does anybody, while we notice the exec, does anybody have any preliminary things to say about either of the 2 bills? Something for any of us to think about. I mean, we're in exec technically. I'm not going to have any votes, but if you'd like to speak, I've noticed an exec. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to hold off on the exec and we'll have this another day. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone.